After a life-changing accident left me in a wheelchair, my greedy husband abandoned me. At my father-in-law's funeral, he threw divorce papers in my face and cruelly shouted, "I don't need a disabled wife." He laughed, claiming, "Now I own the $250 million company," and kicked me out. But what he didn't know was that my secret revenge was already set, and the very next day, he found himself behind bars. My name is Sophia Evans, and this is my story. A story of betrayal, survival, and the strength to rise again. It all started in New York City, a place where dreams are made, but also where lives can be torn apart in an instant. I've always been the kind of person who believed in hard work and dedication. I wasn't born into wealth, but I married into it. My husband, Mark, was the son of Richard Evans, a powerful businessman who owned a $250 million empire. Mark had everything handed to him on a silver platter: money, status, and a family legacy. But it was all too much for him. Mark didn't care about the company, didn't care about building anything for himself. He lived a life of leisure, relying on his father's money. The only thing he seemed interested in was wasting the life his father had worked so hard to build. I was different. I worked hard for everything I achieved. When I married Mark, I was already a senior executive at my father-in-law's company. I worked my way up, proving my worth every day. I was passionate about the business. I wanted to make a name for myself, but also, I wanted to make Richard proud. He always had high hopes for me, seeing the potential in me that Mark lacked. I didn't mind it. I didn't need to be treated like royalty. I wanted to earn everything on my own. But Mark? He did nothing. He would often spend his time at bars or lounging around the house, spending his father's money as if it grew on trees. At first, I thought he'd grow up, mature, and take on some responsibility. But as the years passed, I realized that wasn't going to happen. It was like living with a man-child. And yet, I stayed. For the sake of our marriage, I told myself I could make things work. But I couldn't change him. And deep down, I knew I was alone. Then, everything changed. My life, my whole world, turned upside down in an instant. One rainy evening, I was driving home from a meeting when the accident happened. The details still feel like a blur. One moment, I was on the road, and the next, my car was flipped over, crushed against the barrier. The pain was immediate. I could feel my legs, but I couldn't move them. Panic flooded my mind. I knew something was horribly wrong. I was rushed to the hospital. The doctors told me the worst news. My legs were severely injured, and I would be unable to walk for a long time, possibly forever. It felt like my life had been stolen from me in that one moment. The thought of never walking again haunted me. But the hardest part wasn't the injury itself. It was the people around me. My husband, Mark, who should have been my rock, barely came to visit. His indifference stung like 1,000 needles. He'd come to the hospital, sit there for a while, then leave, saying he had more important things to do. He was only concerned about his own comfort. Not once did he ask how I was doing or express any real empathy for what I was going through. But there was one person who showed me kindness: my father-in-law, Richard. Richard Evans, the man who had built everything with his own hands. Despite his tough exterior, he had a heart that cared. He made sure I had the best doctors, the best rehabilitation experts. He visited me often, even after long days at work, and made sure I knew he was there for me. I appreciated that more than I could ever put into words. For a moment, it felt like he was the only one who saw me, not as a burden, but as a person in need of support. While I was struggling to come to terms with my new reality, Richard took the time to talk to me, encouraging me not to lose hope. "You're strong, Sophia," he'd say. "I know you'll get through this." And for the first time in a long time, I believed someone had faith in me. However, life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. I had barely begun to adjust to my wheelchair when the phone call came. Richard had suffered a heart attack. It was sudden, and before I knew it, he was gone. The funeral was a blur of faces, tears, and whispered condolences. But something happened during that time that would change everything. Richard, before his death, had made a decision that no one knew about, not even Mark. He had transferred everything, the company, the properties, the money, into my name. Richard knew Mark would squander the family legacy. He knew that Mark was incapable of handling the responsibility. So, with a clear mind, Richard entrusted me with everything. He left it all to me. At the time, I didn't know any of this. I was still recovering, still processing the loss of the man who had been more of a father to me than my own had ever been. But the moment I found out about Richard's decision was the moment my life took another turn, one I wasn't prepared for. After the funeral, Mark's behavior changed drastically. His indifference turned into something darker. One afternoon, while I was still trying to heal, he came to me. With a cold expression, he threw a set of divorce papers in front of me. His words hit me like a slap in the face. "I don't need you anymore," he said, his voice emotionless. "Now that I own everything, now that I control the $250 million company, you're just a burden to me. I don't want a disabled wife. Leave." The shock was overwhelming. I sat there, unable to comprehend what he had just said. His words were cruel, heartless, and the weight of them crushed me. I couldn't understand how he could say that to me, how he could just throw away everything we had built together. And just like that, he ordered me out of the house. I was devastated, but I was also angry. This wasn't the man I had married. This was a stranger, someone I no longer recognized. I didn't know what to do. I was lost, both emotionally and physically. But deep down, something in me began to shift. I had to fight back. I couldn't let him destroy me. I contacted a lawyer. I had no idea what my rights were, and I certainly didn't know the full extent of what Richard had done. But soon, I would find out just how much my father-in-law had truly believed in me. I was in the process of finding out just how deep the betrayal ran when something inside me began to change. I wasn't going to be a victim. Not anymore. I didn't know it then, but everything was about to change. It took me a while to pull myself together after Mark's betrayal. At first, I couldn't even wrap my mind around what he had said. How could he just throw everything away? Our marriage, my recovery, the love and support I had given him? It all meant nothing to him. He was more concerned with what he could get from his father's wealth than with being a decent human being. I spent the first few days in a fog of disbelief, replaying his cruel words in my mind. It hurt more than the accident itself, the way he had discarded me like I was nothing. But deep down, I knew I couldn't let him win. I had to find out more about what had happened. I had to understand my rights, what my father-in-law, Richard, had left behind. I couldn't just walk away and let him take everything without a fight. That's when I reached out to a lawyer. I knew the situation was complex, and I needed someone to help me navigate it. The lawyer I contacted was efficient, calm, and direct. He listened to me, took down my details, and assured me that he would look into everything, from the property to the company shares. I could sense that he was just as shocked by what I told him as I was. But as he dug deeper, I soon learned the truth, something I hadn't expected, something that would change everything. The truth was, Richard had left everything to me. Every last share of the company, every building, every property. Everything had been transferred into my name before his death. It was his final decision, one made out of trust and necessity. He had seen through Mark's immaturity, his irresponsible ways, and had decided to pass the family legacy onto me instead. Richard knew that Mark wouldn't be able to manage the company, let alone keep the wealth intact. He had made sure that I, not Mark, would be the one to carry the torch. I couldn't believe it. I felt a strange mix of emotions, shock, relief, and anger. On one hand, I was grateful for the trust Richard had placed in me, especially after all the years of hard work I'd put into the company. But on the other hand, I was furious. I had been married to Mark for years, and here I was, inheriting the entire empire that should have been his by birthright. The thought of Mark, selfish, lazy Mark, thinking the company was his to inherit, only to realize now that it wasn't, it felt like a cruel twist of fate. I spent a few days in contemplation, letting this revelation sink in. I thought about how I would confront Mark, how I would make him understand that I was no longer the weak, dependent woman he thought I was. I was a survivor. I had been through so much already, and I wasn't going to let him take everything from me. I was the rightful owner now, and I would take what was mine. It wasn't long before my recovery began to speed up. After weeks of hard work, physical therapy, and sheer determination, I was able to walk again. Slowly at first, shaky and uncertain, but each step was a victory. With each step, I felt stronger, not just physically, but emotionally. I had been through so much, and now I had my legs back. I wasn't the same person who had been wheeled around in that hospital bed. I wasn't the same person who had been left behind by a husband who couldn't even be bothered to care. And that's when it hit me. I was going to take control. I was going to walk into that office, into that company, and claim what was rightfully mine. The thought of Mark, sitting there pretending he was in charge, made me sick. He had no idea what was coming. I called my lawyer, and together, we made a plan. It was time for me to make my move. I wasn't going to sit back and let Mark think he could keep everything. I wasn't going to let him get away with what he'd done to me. I was going to confront him, and I was going to take what he thought was his. The day I finally walked into that office, I felt a surge of power. I had been patient, but now I was ready. I pushed through the doors of the company headquarters, heading straight to the CEO's office. And there he was, Mark, sitting at the desk like he owned the place. When he saw me walk in, I could see the shock in his eyes. He hadn't expected me to recover so quickly, and certainly hadn't expected me to be walking into that office, confident and strong. For a moment his face froze, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. But he quickly masked it with a sneer, acting as if he hadn't just thrown me out of our home days before. Back again? Mark sneered. What are you doing here, Sophia? Come to beg? You know this is my company now. You're nothing more than a disabled wife with no place here. I held my ground.
No, Mark.
This company is mine. I own it now. He laughed, a bitter, condescending laugh. You think I'm going to believe that? You're delusional. You don't own anything. Now get out of here. You're wasting my time. I reached into my bag and pulled out the legal documents my lawyer had helped me gather. I have the paperwork. Everything Richard left, it's all mine. Not yours. Mark's face paled as he scanned the papers. This is fake, he spat. You're lying. His tone shifted from arrogant to defensive as he quickly pressed the intercom button, calling for security. Get them out of here.
Now.
But I wasn't leaving. Not this time. My lawyer, who had been standing behind me, was already on the phone with the police. Within minutes, the atmosphere in the office turned tense as security came to escort us out. But before they could lay a hand on us, the police arrived. I stood firm, telling them, Mark Evans is trespassing. He's trying to steal what doesn't belong to him. The officers turned toward Mark. He looked like a man caught in a lie, struggling to maintain his composure. He tried to protest, but it was too late. His world was crumbling around him. As the police moved him out of the office, I knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The moment I saw Mark being escorted out of that office by the police, I felt a rush of victory, but it wasn't complete. I could see the panic in his eyes, the way his composure was slipping. For a brief second, I almost felt sorry for him. But then I remembered everything he'd done to me, everything he'd taken from me when I needed him the most. I wasn't about to back down now. I wasn't just reclaiming my position in the company. I was reclaiming my dignity. Mark tried to make excuses, his voice shaking with anger and desperation. This is a setup. You're all making a huge mistake, he yelled, but his words only grew weaker as the police led him down the hallway, his face reddening with frustration. I stood tall, my heart pounding in my chest, feeling a sense of pride I hadn't felt in so long. I had fought back, and I had won. The company that Richard had built and entrusted to me was now mine to lead. No longer would I be the woman stuck in a wheelchair, reliant on the kindness of others. No longer would I be the woman who was invisible to the one person who should have cared for her. I was the CEO now, and nothing was going to take that away from me. Once Mark was gone, I turned to my lawyer and nodded. It was time to take the final steps. I had reclaimed my place in the company, but the journey was far from over. I couldn't let Mark think he could get away with what he'd done. The betrayal, the cruelty, the way he had discarded me like I was nothing. It all needed to be addressed. But as I stood there, savoring the moment, I knew one thing for sure. I had made the right choice. I wasn't going to let Mark's greed and selfishness define my life any longer. He had pushed me to the edge, and now I was in control. Later that afternoon, I received a call from my lawyer. Apparently, Mark wasn't going down without a fight. He had already been calling our old family friends, trying to convince them that I had forged the documents, that the whole thing was a lie. He thought he could manipulate the situation the way he always had. But this time, it wasn't going to work. This time, he had underestimated me. I didn't hesitate for a second. I instructed my lawyer to press charges for harassment and fraud. I was done with Mark and his lies. If he thought he could just walk away from the mess he created, he had another thing coming. The next morning, as I arrived at the company, I could feel the eyes of the staff on me. Word had already spread about Mark's outburst, and I could sense the tension in the air. But as I walked through the hallways, I noticed something else. People were looking at me differently. There was respect in their eyes now, where there had been none before. Richard had always told me I had the potential to lead. Now I was showing them I could. As I sat in Richard's old office, now my office, I finally allowed myself a moment of peace. It had been a long, painful journey to get here. The accident, the betrayal, the months of uncertainty, it had all brought me to this point. And now I was in control. The battle with Mark wasn't over yet, but I was no longer afraid of him. He had underestimated me at every turn, thinking that I was weak, that I was just a woman in a wheelchair. But I had proven him wrong. I had shown him that I wasn't someone to be cast aside. I was stronger than he could ever imagine. The next step was clear. Mark needed to be held accountable for everything he'd done. And I wasn't going to let him get away with it.
Not now.
Not ever. It wasn't long before Mark's arrogance led him straight into a pit he couldn't crawl out of. I had already put the wheels in motion with my lawyer. We were going to make sure he was held accountable for his actions. Everything from the fraudulent claims to his cruel treatment of me. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but nothing worth having ever was. It was a few weeks after the police had removed Mark from the office that the next shocking turn of events came. My lawyer contacted me one morning, informing me that Mark had been trying to dig his way out of the mess he had created by calling in favors from people he thought would help him. But it wasn't working. The people he'd tried to manipulate had begun distancing themselves from him, including our old family friends. They weren't buying his lies anymore. The weight of his actions was finally catching up to him. I hadn't expected this to happen so quickly, but it felt like the universe was finally delivering the justice I'd been waiting for. Mark had lost more than his place in the company. His friends, his reputation, everything he had relied on was crumbling. The things he thought would save him, his wealth, his connections, were slipping through his fingers. And then, the final blow came. The media caught wind of the situation. Somehow, the story of Mark's betrayal, his false claims about the company, and his cruel actions toward me started to make waves. It didn't take long for the public to turn on him, and his so-called friends began to scatter. The company's board, too, started to ask questions. They wanted nothing to do with the mess he had caused. I made the decision to confront him one last time. I wasn't doing it for my own satisfaction, but because Mark needed to understand that actions have consequences. I wanted him to know that he couldn't just walk away and pretend nothing happened. I scheduled a meeting at the company. I was ready for this final confrontation, and I wasn't going to let him off the hook. I walked into the room with my lawyer by my side, and there he was, Mark, sitting across from me, his face pale, his shoulders hunched as if he already knew he was on the losing side. "Sophia," he started, his voice shaky. I didn't mean to." I cut him off. "Don't," I said firmly. "You've said enough. I don't need your excuses, Mark. You've shown me who you really are, and now you'll face the consequences." His expression twisted in panic. "I didn't steal anything. It's all a mistake." I reached into my bag and pulled out the recording I had made of his earlier conversation, the one where he had made derogatory comments about me and the company. I pressed play, and his own voice filled the room. "The worst thing you can do is marry an ugly woman. I'll tolerate it because she's rich and will make me rich." His voice echoed in the silence. I watched as his face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to come up with a defense that wouldn't come. "You're nothing but a liar and a fraud," I said. "And I'll make sure the world knows who you really are." Mark stood up suddenly, his anger flaring, but there was nothing he could do. He was caught in his own web of lies. He tried to deny it, tried to defend himself, but the damage was done. Before he could say another word, I turned to the security guard at the door. "Throw him out," I ordered. He hesitated for just a moment, then complied, escorting Mark out of the office. I looked at the police officer standing behind me, and with a clear, steady voice, I said, "Arrest him." Mark was still protesting as the officers cuffed him. His desperation was palpable, but it didn't matter. He had crossed the line one too many times. "Please don't do this," he pleaded from his knees, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. Please." I looked at him, and for a moment, I saw the man I had once loved. But then, I remembered all the years of pain, the loneliness, the betrayal. I remembered the look on his face when he told me I was no longer useful to him. "No," I said, my voice cold. "You're not sorry. And I don't need someone like you in my life anymore." With that, I turned away. The officers let him out, and I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I didn't need to explain myself any further. I had made my decision. I was moving on. As I stood in that office, now fully in control, I realized something. All the pain, all the betrayal, had brought me to this point, not just as the CEO of a $250 million company, but as a woman who had found her strength. I had been through so much, but I had come out stronger. Mark had tried to break me, but instead, he had unknowingly fueled my fire. I wasn't just the woman he had discarded. I was the woman who had reclaimed her life. I was free, and I was ready for whatever came next.